It is dusk, and you are afraid for your sheep. You cross the whole of the world for this paddock. Everything you own is walking around in it on four legs. And lately, in the gray of the mornings, you have been finding them dead. Now something moves at the edge of the trees. It stops. It turns its head toward you. And it opens its mouth. And the jaw swings wider than any mouth you have ever seen on a living thing. Wide enough, you are certain, to close around the throat of a lamb. You are looking at the animal that is ruining you. You have no doubt at all. You reach for the rifle. You are wrong. Not a little wrong. Wrong in a way that will take 100 years, a government bounty, and the death of an entire species to undo. That wide and frightening jaw could barely hold a struggling rabbit. It almost certainly never killed a single one of your sheep. But no one will think to ask its bones for another lifetime. And by the time they do, there will be exactly one of these animals left alive on the earth, pacing a bare concrete floor in the last zoo that will ever hold one, in front of the only camera that will ever film it. This is the story of the Tasmanian tiger, by the thylacine, the one extinction that humanity kept on record, and it is, at its heart, a wrongful conviction, a species we paid to erase, for a crime its own jaw could not commit. We did not start its ending, we only chose the day it finished, and we chose it in the dark, at a tree line, looking at a mouth, and being sure. Picture a wolf, the long muzzle, the deep chest, the lean legs built for a lifetime of walking. Now give it a stiff, thick-based tail it cannot wag, a coat of dark stripes across its lower back, and a pouch, because this was no wolf. The thylacine was a marsupial, closer kin to a kangaroo or a possum than to any dog that ever lived. The line that led to wolves and the line that led to the thylacine parted ways deep in the age of the dinosaurs, where the pouched mammals and the placental mammals divide, something like 160 million years ago. And yet, given 160 million years apart, on opposite sides of the Earth, evolution built the two of them into nearly the same shape. A predator's body arrived at twice, from completely different beginnings. Biologists still teach the thylacine for exactly this reason. It is one of the cleanest cases we have of two unrelated animals sculpted by the same job into the same form. It carried its differences quietly. Both males and females bore a pouch. One of only two kinds of animal ever recorded to do so. In the female, it held the young. In the male, it was a simple sheath, a protection for running through dense scrub. And it could open its jaws to almost 80 degrees, the widest gape of any meat-eating mammal we know of. It looks, in the old film, like a threat, like the animal is showing you everything it could do to you. Hold onto that jaw, because it is going to matter enormously. That wide, frightening mouth is at the center of the injustice this whole story turns on, and the animal's own skull is the evidence that will clear it. Here is where the familiar story begins to come apart. The version most of us carry is simple. A healthy, widespread animal, then Europeans arrive and within a lifetime it is gone. A clean crime with a clean villain. The trouble is the genome. In recent years, scientists read the thylacine's DNA, recovered from a young animal, preserved in a jar for more than a century. And written into that DNA was a demographic memory, a record of how many of them there had been, stretching far back into the past. What the record showed was a species that had been thinning out for a very long time. Its genetic diversity, the raw variety that lets a population adapt and endure, had begun to collapse somewhere between 70,000 and 120,000 years ago. Sit with that number. The first human beings did not reach Australia until roughly 65,000 years ago. The thylacine's long decline had already begun before there was anyone on that continent to blame. It was running on a thin genetic margin, vulnerable, inbred, fragile, while the whole human chapter of Australia was still in the future. It had spread once across the mainland, across the island of Tasmania, and up into New Guinea. But around 3,000 years ago, it vanished from the mainland entirely, at almost the same moment as its cousin, the Tasmanian devil. And here the story turns again. On the mainland, it was not the ancient frailty that finished them. That population was still widespread when the end came, undone not by any weakness of its own, but by the world around it changing faster than it could. Why is still argued. For a long time, the blame fell on the dingo, the wild dog, that arrived on the mainland in roughly the same window. But the more carefully researchers have looked, the more the dingo has been let off the hook. The better explanation is a convergence, a shift in the climate, the intensifying cycle of droughts we now call El Niño, drying the interior, and a growing human population pressing on the same shrinking land. Not one killer, a closing vice. The dingo never reached Tasmania, and so, on that island alone, the thylacine held on for another 3,000 years. And here is the detail that turns the tragedy from sad to almost unbearable. The models of that island population suggest that, in its last centuries, the Tasmanian thylacine was not still sliding towards zero. It was recovering, climbing back slowly from an earlier low, right up until the year 1803, which is the year the ships came. The British came to Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, they called it then, with sheep. And in a new country, every loss in the flock needs a culprit. They found one in the striped animal at the tree line, with the terrible wide jaw. It looked like a predator. It looked, to a frightened farmer at dusk, exactly like the thing that had been killing his livelihood. And so a story took hold. The tiger was a sheep killer, and the tiger had to go. The killing was organized, and it was paid for. A private land company put a price on the animal's head as early as 1830. Then the government of Tasmania made it official. From 1888 to 1909, the colony paid a bounty, £1 for a grown thylacine, half that for a young one. Over the years of that scheme, they paid out 2,184 bounties, and that number is the floor, not the ceiling. It counts only the animals someone bothered to bring in for the money. Many more were killed and never claimed. Here's the part that should stop you. The whole justification and the sheep killing, the reason a government paid to erase a species, appears to have been a myth, and we can show it with the animal's own body. Scientists built a computer model of the thylacine's skull and tested what it could survive biting. They compared it to its relatives, the living Tasmanian devil and the quoll, animals that really do crush bone and take struggling prey. The thylacine failed the test. Its skull was the weakest of the three by a wide margin, too gracile, too lightly built to safely bring down anything much larger than itself. A struggling, kicking, full-grown sheep would very likely have injured it. Its real diet was small things, bandicoots, possums, little wallabies. The sheep it supposedly slaughtered were almost certainly killed by feral dogs and paid for by the tiger. Read that again. A government paid for 21 years to exterminate an animal for a crime its own jaw was physically almost incapable of committing. The evidence that could have cleared it was sitting inside its own skull the entire time. No one thought to ask the bones. By the time anyone did, there was almost nothing left to save. By the time the bounty scheme quietly ended in 1909, there was barely a wild thylacine left to pay for. The killing had done the visible work, but it had done that work to a species already weakened from underneath. Genetically frail for tens of thousands of years. Its forests being cleared for farms and timber, its ground crossed now by dogs. Every refuge was smaller than it had been. Every animal was more alone. And then, into that thinned and scattered population, something else may have come. There are records, around 1910, of thylacines vanishing from whole districts with unusual speed. The kind of sudden, total, local disappearance that doesn't look like trapping. It looks like disease. Researchers have argued that an illness, something like the distemper that sweeps through dogs, moved through the thylacines in their final years. In captivity, in that same period, the animal's lifespans more than halved, and the young died first. The signature of an epidemic. But this is a genuine argument, not a settled fact, and honesty demands we say so. Other scientists have run the numbers and concluded that we do not actually need a disease to explain the collapse, that the hunting and the habitat loss on a population already so small and so fragile were enough on their own. One of their papers is titled, almost bluntly, "No Need for Disease." Both may be partly right. The truth of the ending is probably not a single blow, but a pile of them. The old genetic frailty, the bounty, the cleared forests, and perhaps a sickness, landing together on an animal that had almost no margin left to absorb any of it. A compounding collapse, no one clean cause. That is usually how a species actually dies. In May of 1936, a trapper in Tasmania named Elias Churchill caught a thylacine. He was not supposed to. By then, a permit was required, and he did not have one. He sold the animal to a small zoo in Hobart called Beaumaris. We do not truly know this animal's name. History remembers it as Benjamin, but that name has no record behind it at all. It surfaced decades later from a man whom researchers cannot even confirm ever worked at the zoo. So we should be honest and set the name gently down. We do not know what, if anything, it was called. We're not even certain whether it was male or female. Serious researchers have studied the old film frame by frame and disagreed with each other. It is widely believed to have been male, but even that, at the very end, we cannot say for sure. What we do have is the film, shot a few years earlier, in the same bare enclosure. The pacing, the turn, the wide and harmless yawn. It is almost unbearable to watch now, knowing what we know. An animal displaying the one feature that had helped doom it to a species that had already decided what it was. And then comes the detail that no writer would dare invent. In July of 1936, the government of Tasmania granted the thylacine official protection. After a private bounty, after a public bounty, after more than a century of paying people to kill it, the law finally, formally, moved to save it. Roughly 59 days later, it was too late. On the night of the 6th of September, 1936, at the Beaumaris Zoo, the last known thylacine on Earth died. By the account most often told, though some researchers now question it, it had been locked out of its sheltered sleeping quarters during a cold snap, exposed to the weather it could not escape. The 7th of September, 1936, that is the date. Most extinctions have no date. They are noticed only long afterward, a silence where something used to be. This one we can mark on a calendar, a species that had crossed 4 million years, and ranged from the deserts of Australia to the forests of New Guinea, ended in a locked yard, in the cold, 59 days after we decided, at last, that it deserved to live. It should end there. It doesn't. Because the thylacine has never quite let us go. Or we have never let go of it. In the decades since that night, more than 1,000 people across Tasmania and the mainland have reported seeing one. A striped shape at the edge of a headlight, something crossing a track at dusk. Hundreds of these sightings have been judged by researchers as genuinely credible, and not one of them in nearly a century has ever produced a body, a clear photograph, or a single thread of DNA. The scientific verdict is quiet and firm. It is gone. The absence itself, after all the searching, is the evidence. And yet, in a laboratory now, its DNA is being read again, not to mourn it this time, but to try to build it back. A research team, working with a company that believes extinction might be reversible, has reconstructed nearly the whole of the thylacine's genome from a specimen preserved for 110 years, and begun editing those instructions into the cells of a living cousin. Be careful here and be honest. There is no thylacine. There is no half thylacine. There is a genome on a screen and an unproven hope. This is real science aimed at a thing that has never been done and may never be. So we are left with the film. A little under a minute of a striped animal pacing a bare floor, turning, yawning, alive, in black and white on a loop that will never move forward. It was fading before we ever found it, and we know that now. But it was still here. It was recovering on its island when we arrived, and we spent 100 years paying to erase it for something it could not have done, and drew up its protection just late enough to mean nothing. The last of its kind. Watched, filmed, dated, and still somehow not quite believed to be gone.